Hey guys, tonight we dive into the hidden world of animals in medieval life. Picture this. You trudge out of your straw-strewn bed just as the first tendrils of dawn slant through a narrow window. The air is damp, smelling faintly of hay, manure, and that unmistakable earthy scent of someone who hasn't seen a proper bath in a week. You probably won't survive this without at least one coughing fit from the dust, or a surprised chicken pecking your toes butt that asks exactly the rhythm of a day in a medieval village. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where my fellow night owls are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You blink against the weak sunlight and stumble into the barn, the floor soft underfoot with straw. Cows lift their heavy heads, amber eyes following you, and the low hum of pigs in their pens greets you like an old, grunting friend. You reach out to stroke a cow's side, its skin warm, coarse, and a little slimy. And you marvel at how central these creatures are to survival. Historians still argue whether medieval villagers valued cows more for milk or for social prestige. Because owning even a single cow could elevate your status in ways that today feel absurdly quaint. You push a pig into position for feeding, and it squeals with theatrical outrage, sending you laughing into a pile of hay. Chickens cluck and hop from roosts, pecking at scattered grain, their feathers brushing your arms like delicate brushes. Some say that chickens could predict the weather. A particularly nervous clucking meant rain might be coming. Superstitions aside, the practical side is undeniable. One healthy chicken could provide daily eggs, vital protein that kept you going through the long, cold winters. You bend to gather them, careful not to break the fragile shells, and feel an odd intimacy in the act. Each egg is a small miracle, a testament to human-animal collaboration that most of us have forgotten in the age of pre-packaged cartons. Pigs are surprisingly clever. You realize one is nudging a piece of root towards you, as if offering a trade, a silent negotiation. Fringe historians sometimes argue that villagers trained pigs not only for food, but for rudimentary tasks, like sniffing out truffles or locating buried treasures, though evidence is spotty and debated. You chuckle, imagining a pig in a tiny medieval scout uniform, and then notice a calf trying to suckle from a cow not its own. A minor identity crisis in the barn, but an ordinary chaos of animal life, the kind that made mornings unpredictable and, honestly, highly entertaining. As you scoop hay into the troughs, you feel the temperature shift. The barn traps warmth from bodies, and a faint, sweet ammonia temps drifts up from the straw. You pause to watch a goat leap onto a hay bale, balancing like a furry acrobat, knocking over a bucket with a loud clatter. In the medieval world, goats were the ultimate multitaskers. They provided milk, meat, leather, and sometimes companionship. But they also had reputations for mischief and stubbornness. Villagers often left them to graze freely near orchards, only to return and find apple cores and shredded bark everywhere. Historians still argue whether goats were a symbol of economic necessity or a kind of rustic entertainment to their way. They shaped the landscape and daily routines. Out in the yard, you notice a flock of geese hissing at a wandering dog. Their sharp, almost comical calls serve both as alarm systems and as companions in keeping watch. Geese were considered excellent guardians. Their vigilance earned them a place alongside dogs in defending property. You crouch to examine the dog, a scrappy shepherd hound with mud-caked fur, and feel a warm sense of collaboration. Humans and animals didn't just coexist, they depended on each other, sometimes humorously, sometimes dangerously. By mid-morning, the stench of the barn mixes with the crisp air outside. You trudge toward the well, stepping carefully around clumps of manure and overturned straw, and glance back at the barnyard, now alive with motion. Chickens chase each other, pigs wallow in mud baths with unbothered bliss, and cows lazily chew cud, casting slow, judgmental glances at your clumsy human feet. You pause to scratch your head, realizing just how interwoven your life is with these creatures. Every chore, every meal, every conversation, even the casual flick of a goat's tail anchors the rhythm of your day. Some fringe sources suggest villagers had secret rituals to appease animals. From whispering spells to cows before milking to tapping the barn beams for luck. You roll your eyes a little, imagining chanting to a pig about its forthcoming bacon fate. But can't deny the psychological comfort in the routine. Medieval life was hard, messy, and unpredictable, and maybe a little superstition helped people feel control over the chaos. Historians still argue whether such practices were widespread or the products of isolated eccentricities. But in this early morning light, you can almost believe in them. Lunch feels like a distant dream because your body is still moving in the slow, immersive rhythm of animal care. You bend to collect eggs again, mindful of the fragile shells, and notice a hen clucking fiercely as a crow struts too close. In the distance, a donkey brays, sending the pigs into a startled frenzy. And the cows turn their heads lazily, annoyed by the noise, but not enough to rise. You can almost hear them thinking, humans are messy, but they feed us, so we'll tolerate them. It's a quiet, funny hierarchy, one that reminds you that medieval villages were alive in ways a simple map could never convey. By afternoon, the sun filters through the barn cracks, warming the dust motes in golden streaks. You trudge out of the barn, sweaty, tired, and inexplicably fond of the creatures that dominate your life. You recall reading that cows were sometimes used in rudimentary health diagnostics. Villagers believed the shape of a cow's hoof or the texture of milk could signal impending illness, a folk wisdom blending observation and superstition. You smile at the thought, knowing that much of what you've experienced is a mix of careful routine, human ingenuity, and the stubborn, unpredictable behavior of your animal coworkers. As the day progresses, chores blend seamlessly into observation. You notice a pig dragging a soiled blanket across the yard, perhaps testing its strength or scent-marking territory. Chickens continue their frantic scavenging, a constant, amusing background hum. Goats engage in a slow-motion wrestling match, and the cows, ever dignified, chew their cud with a regal patience that would make a modern yoga instructor jealous. You sit on the edge of a hay bale, catching your breath, and realize that the subtle rhythms of animal life feeding schedules, play, mischief, and cooperation dictate more of the human schedule than most would admit. Some historians suggest that this intimate animal knowledge laid the groundwork for later agricultural innovations. Villagers who watched and learned could anticipate breeding cycles, meet disease outbreaks, or even the optimal moment for plowing. Fringe theorists sometimes claim that animal behavior influenced medieval economics in ways we don't fully understand, like predicting crop yields through subtle livestock patterns. You shrug and chuckle at the thought. Imagine a pig serving as a stock market advisor. Still, the point is clear. Without animals, the medieval world would collapse into chaos far faster than we could imagine. Evening approaches, but the barn and yard remain alive. You trudge back inside to deliver the last feed, the smell of hay mixing with sweat and animal musk. Chickens roost, pigs settle into mudbeds, and cows glance at you with patient, unwavering eyes. It's a quiet intimacy that's easy to miss if you rush through life. But here, every motion, every grunt, every cluck is part of a larger conversation. You can almost hear the unspoken rules of coexistence: respect, routine, and a tiny bit of humor. The day winds down with a final check. Water troughs filled, feed scattered appropriately, and animals accounted for. You step back and inhale the aroma of hay, manure, and warm animals, feeling an odd comfort in the chaotic order. Night will soon fall, and the barn will settle into a low hum of contented digestion and occasional snorts. You sit on a bale, exhausted but oddly serene, appreciating the subtle choreography that has carried life forward for centuries. Remember that morning chaos with the crow and the hen? It's just one of countless small dramas you witness daily, and yet it shapes how people eat, work, and survive. Medieval life was messy, humorous, and entirely dependent on a caste of animals that you might never have consciously noticed, but now, you see, they are the hidden heartbeat of the village. You trudge along the muddy track leading to the fields, feeling the early morning chill bite at your fingers and nose, and hear the familiar, rhythmic clomp of hooves behind you. Horses, oxen, and donkeys, sure dependable, sometimes infuriating co-workers, are waiting, their harnesses creaking and collars jangling in protest. Today, you're heading to the plowed fields, the earth still soft from last night's rain, and the work ahead will test your patience, your stamina, and your ability to read animal moods. Remember, historians still argue whether medieval draft animals were valued more for productivity or for the social prestige of owning them. But as you'll soon discover, it's impossible to separate utility from pride. The first horse, a stout mare with a glossy chestnut coat, snorts impatiently as you adjust her harness. You scratch behind her ears, feeling the twitch of muscles beneath the skin, and mutter an apology for the tug on her reins. She seems to understand, or at least tolerates you. Oxen, meanwhile, are in their own world, slow-moving yet inexorably strong. You can almost feel their willpower radiating from them as they step into the yoke. There's a rhythm here, a delicate dance of pressure and release, commands and responses. And it's easy to forget that without these creatures, plowing even a small medieval field would take twice as long to fail entirely. Donkeys, of course, add a layer of chaos to this pastoral ballet. The one assigned to carry your supplies brays loudly, a nasal sound that pierces the morning air. It's a performance, you suspect, a combination of protest and self-entertainment, but it also keeps you on your toes. Fringe historians sometimes argue that donkeys were subtly preferred over horses for certain long-haul labor because of their surprising endurance and clever navigation skills. You roll your eyes, imagining a donkey as a medieval GPS, and yet the idea isn't entirely absurd. As you settle into the slow rhythm of fieldwork, you notice the subtle ways these animals communicate. A slight shuffle of a hoof, a flick of an ear, a shift in posture, these are warnings, cues, and even small delights. Horses especially are sensitive. One wrong tug on the reins, and the plow veers, furrowing the earth unevenly. You mutter under your breath, "Sorry, girl," as the mare corrects herself with a stubborn step. And you're reminded how much patience medieval farmers required. Even the smallest mistake could cost hours of labor, or worse, damage the delicate balance between animal and task. The oxen grunt contentedly, or is it complaining? As they pull the heavy plow through the clay-rich soil, you wipe sweat from your brow and notice the odd, satisfying scent of churned earth mixing with hay dust. Here's a fact many people forget. Oxen were often castrated to improve temperament and strength, turning otherwise unruly bulls into patient, work-ready partners. Still, they had personalities. The older ox in your team seems to enjoy teasing the younger one, nudging him off course just enough to make you sigh. You laugh despite yourself, because medieval farmers surely had to develop a sense of humor to survive. Meanwhile, a horse missteps on a slick patch, and you scramble to steady the plow, feeling the raw, unfiltered connection between human and beast. Every motion is tactile, visceral, a push-pull between strength and subtlety. The plow cuts a straight line eventually, but you feel the sweat and strain in every muscle. Understanding why animals were considered the backbone of medieval survival. Without them, even the most fertile land is just dirt and weeds. Lunchtime arrives, though your stomach feels like it's taken a beating from the exertion. You kneel by a stream to sip water and watch the oxen drink with slow deliberation, their long tongues lapping at the surface. Horses lower their heads, flicking flies away with swishing tails, and the donkey brays as if complaining about your sandwich. You pull a small piece of bread from your satchel and toss it toward the donkey, who snatches it expertly and disappears behind a bush, triumphant. You chuckle. Feeding them is as much negotiation as sustenance. Fringe historians sometimes suggest that medieval farmers treated their draft animals almost like members of the family, giving small rewards and praising good work, a curious blend of utility and affection. After a brief rest, you head back into the fields. The sun climbs higher, heating your neck and back, and the earth softens further under the plow. Horses and oxen settle into a meditative rhythm. And you notice a minor marvel. The coordination required between animal and human mind to create straight furrows is almost instinctual. You push the plow with precision, matching their steps, feeling a rare harmony that almost feels spiritual. Historians still argue whether medieval people consciously understood animal psychology or simply learned through trial, error, and observation. Either way, the lesson is clear. Coexistence required attention, patience, and empathy. By mid-afternoon, fatigue sets in. Your muscles ache, sweat drips into your eyes, and the animals seem equally weary. The older ox nearly sits mid-pool, and the mare slows her pace, forcing you to stop and give them a moment. This pause allows you to observe details you'd otherwise miss. The sheen of sweat on a horse's coat, the twitch of an ox's ears in the breeze, the donkey nibbling at a stray clump of grass, completely unconcerned with your schedule. It's a slow, almost meditative observation that's hard to achieve when modern life has conditioned you to constant distraction. You sigh, realizing medieval farmers were experts at noticing nuance, necessity, and nuance again. The plow finally completed. You step back, admired the furrows stretching across the field like neat, brown waves, and glance at your animal team with genuine respect. You pat the mare, the oxen, and even the grumpy donkey, whispering small thanks for their labor. A small, fringe belief held that talking to draft animals could improve their efficiency or calm their spirits, a superstition. Yes, but perhaps rooted in the practical truth that animals respond to tone, consistency, and attention. Historians still argue whether these practices were meaningful rituals or convenient justifications for anthropomorphizing behavior. Next comes transport. You hitch the horses to a cart, loading it with bundles of hay and harvested vegetables. The donkey is tasked with a smaller load, but seems intent on leading its own parade. The coordination is tricky, especially when the animals sense each other's energy. Horses have a herd instinct, oxen are stubbornly independent, and donkeys, well, they delight in testing boundaries. You swear softly under your breath as the cart wobbles, then straighten it, feeling the tug of leather straps and the strength of muscle beneath. This moment underscores why draft animals were worth their weight in gold ore, at least in barrels of ale during medieval times. As you trudge toward the village, the animals set their own pace, forcing you to negotiate, cajole, and occasionally scold. They are partners, not tools, and their moods dictate the rhythm of labor. A sudden gust of wind sends hay flying, startling the horses and causing the donkey to bray in indignation. You laugh despite the chaos. It's a daily comedy, a living lesson in humility, patience, and observation. Fringe tales even tell of oxen or horses running away with carts full of treasure or food, prompting villagers to chase them in what historians describe as either amusing anecdote or cautionary folklore. Back in the village, the cart is unloaded, and you reward the animals with scraps of grain, a rub behind the ears, and quiet gratitude. Horses are brushed, oxen unyoked, and the donkey is allowed a few minutes to graze freely. You notice subtle interactions. The mare nudges the donkey gently, perhaps asserting gentle dominance. The oxen bump sides in what looks like contented solidarity. It's a social world layered atop a labor economy, a hierarchy dictated not just by human rules, but by animal behavior. Historians still debate how much villagers actually understood this social layer versus responding purely to pragmatic necessity. But either way, it shaped everyday life. Evening approaches, and the sun casts long shadows across the village. You herd the animals into their pens and stables, a process requiring patience, understanding, and a gentle authority that humans had to earn. Cows, horses, and oxen each have their quirks. Some resist entry, others follow with quiet dignity, and the donkey. Well, the donkey eventually wanders in after you bribe it with a handful of oats. You pause, watching the animals settle, the barn doors creaking. The smell of hay mixing with earth and sweat, and marvel at how crucial this symbiosis is. Without them, the village would grind to a halt. Finally, you sit on a fence, brushing stray hair from your hands and surveying the day's work. The field is neatly plowed, the cart emptied, and the animals fed and resting. You inhale deeply, appreciating the warmth of sun, the faint breeze, and the quiet hum of living creatures. You think about the skill, knowledge, and patience required to work in tandem with anomalous, a skill often overlooked, yet fundamental to medieval life. In these moments, the animals are not just laborers, they are collaborators, teachers, and companions. The medieval day pulses with their strength, humor, and subtle social cues, a rhythm modern humans rarely experience. You feel the pulse, the shared labor, and the humor. And for a fleeting moment, understand why so many villagers dedicated their lives to the careful observation, care, and sometimes odd rituals surrounding these indispensable creatures. You trudge through the narrow dirt paths of the village, the ground littered with stray feathers, clumps of hay, and the occasional rodent scuttling in panic. Today, your companions are smaller, furrier, and far more mischievous. The cats, rats, and mice that wage their quiet wars just beneath human awareness. The morning sun glints off the rooftops, and you hear the faint scuttle of paws across roof tiles. Cats arch backs, whiskers twitching, eyes narrowed in concentration, while rats skitter through the shadows, daring to steal crumbs or gnaw at the corn stores. You probably won't survive this if you're squeamish about vermin or if you underestimate their cleverness, but that's exactly what makes medieval life so vibrantly unpredictable. So, before you get too comfortable in your modern mindset, remember that every barn, pantry, and alley is a battleground. You crouch beside a pile of spilled grain, spotting a mouse trying to drag a kernel twice its size. You gently blow on it, watching it pause mid-heist, tiny nose twitching, and you can't help but laugh. Cats stationed strategically nearby execute their patrols with the precision of seasoned soldiers. The fat tabby on the fence watches the mouse with barely contained delight, tail flicking in rhythmic anticipation. Historians still argue whether cats were primarily valued for their practical rodent control or as beloved companions. But your morning observation suggests a bit of both. Medieval villagers relied on their feline workforce for survival, yet it's clear some relationships bordered on affection or, at least, grudging tolerance. Rats, however, are the ultimate medieval anti-heroes. You spot a particularly daring one dragging a piece of bread across the yard, disappearing into a crack in the wall with acrobatic grace. Fringe sources suggest that certain rat species were so clever that villagers considered them almost intelligent adversaries, capable of learning traps or navigating elaborate storage defenses. You shake your head, imagining a rodent general planning a heist on the village bakery, and can't help but admire the ingenuity. Modern pest control has nothing on medieval improvisation. Cats aren't just hunters, they are tacticians. You watch the tabby leap from roof to fence post, silent and fluid, its eyes locked on a hiding rat. It pauses, calculating, almost theatrically, before pouncing. You notice a second cat waiting in ambush, a silent partner in what historians still debate as coordinated hunting versus coincidence. The scene feels like a miniature theater of strategy, suspense, and comedy, played out in a sunlit village corner. You snort with amusement, imagining medieval children placing bets on which cat would win the chase. While you watch, an elderly villager shuffles past, muttering about missing corn and mysterious gnaw marks. You listen closely, catching snippets of the folklore interwoven with practical concerns. A black cat crossing a path could be unlucky. A rat leaving unusual tracks meant disease might follow. Medieval superstition often gave weight to animal behavior, blending observation with imagination. Fringe scholars propose that some of these omens were early attempts at environmental monitoring, a quirky way to interpret patterns in nature. You smirk, thinking that a rat might actually have been a better predictor of plague than most human experts. By mid-morning, the sun warms your back, and you trudge into the barn to check the grain stores. Mice have claimed a few kernels, leaving faint trails of dust and tiny teeth marks. You sigh, knowing that pest management is an endless cycle of vigilance, traps, and occasionally cats with unassailable pride. Feeding the cats a small portion of leftover fish from yesterday's dinner feels like diplomacy, a tacit acknowledgement of their service. You realize that these small creatures, so easily overlooked, wield enormous influence over daily survival. Without them, your grains might remain untouched. With them, mischief and charm coexist in equal measure. A group of kittens tumbles near the doorway, rolling and pouncing in a display of chaotic energy. You can't help but join the game for a few moments, your laughter echoing off wooden beams. Cats, especially young ones, were often allowed to roam freely to learn hunting skills, providing both entertainment and practical pest control. You watch one kitten leap onto a pile of straw, narrowly missing a startled rat, and marvel at the ingenuity of both predator and prey. Historians still argue whether kittens were deliberately raised for pest management or simply tolerated as natural apprentices, but the end result is the same. Balance in the barn ecosystem. Rats, ever persistent, make a bold move across the barn rafters. You squint, tracking their movement, and notice a pattern. They avoid certain shadows, use certain pathways, almost as if they know the barn's architecture better than any human. Fringe accounts even describe rats leading cats on wild chases through entire villages, creating miniature spectacles that entertained as much as they threatened food stores. You imagine standing in the middle of a crowd centuries ago, watching the drama unfold above your head, and can almost hear the laughter and wagers. You trudge to the pantry, keeping an eye out for rats and mice that might have ventured inside. A mouse darts across the floorboards, pausing near the hearth, and you realize just how intimate these conflicts were. Every meal, every grain, every stored vegetable depended on vigilance, observation, and occasionally cunning tricks. Cats sit perched on shelves like silent sentinels, eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. The scene is a delicate choreography of attention and instinct, one that would have been entirely normal for medieval households, but feels exotic and theatrical to modern eyes. By afternoon, the village square becomes alive with the sounds of humans, merchants, and animals alike. Cats weave between legs, occasionally startling chickens or small dogs. Rats retreat to shadowed corners, plotting their next foray. You notice that the presence of cats indirectly shapes human behavior. Markets are arranged to minimize rodent access. Storage chests are raised and spills are meticulously cleaned. Even the slightest neglect invites tiny chaos. Historians still debate how much of medieval urban planning was influenced by animals versus human convenience. But watching this tiny ecosystem, you begin to see the interconnectedness of all participants. Lunch arrives, though it's more of a snack, a hunk of bread and some cheese. You toss a small scrap to a cat lounging on a windowsill, and it eyes you with what could be mild contempt or gentle amusement. The cat accepts, then turns to inspect a new shadow moving across the courtyard. You sip water and note the patterns. Rodents avoiding open spaces, cats stalking deliberately, humans navigating the chaos without even realizing it. Fringe historians argue that medieval villagers might have had unwritten manuals on reading animal behavior. To predict everything from weather to food scarcity, though evidence is anecdotal. You nod quietly, thinking that observation alone would have been enough for most villagers to survive. By mid-afternoon, you trudge back to the barn for another check. Kittens chase a loose rat, tumbling over each other with wild enthusiasm. The adult cats, meanwhile, supervise with regal composure, intervening only when necessary. Rats retreat strategically, using narrow gaps and clever detours to evade capture. You watch, fascinated, the unspoken rules of this tiny universe. Every chase, every pause, every sudden pivot is a negotiation of survival, instinct, and occasionally humor. You chuckle, thinking that medieval villagers probably saw these interactions daily and rarely bored of them. You notice one clever rat dragging a piece of bread across the yard, only to have a cat intercept it mid-stride. The two pause, assessing each other in a silent standoff before the rat scurries to safety. Fringe accounts suggest that some villagers created complex rat runs and small traps inspired by these behaviors. A combination of practical ingenuity and entertainment. You imagine tiny rat obstacle courses entirely plausible in a world where observation was both necessity and amusement. Historians still argue whether such practices were widespread or limited to eccentric households. But in your observation, the logic is clear. Every creature has its role, and chaos is always tempered by routine. Evening approaches, and the barn settles into a lull. Mice retreat to shadowed corners, rats vanish to hidden crevices, and cats stretch lazily, tongues flicking in self-satisfaction. You sit on a bale of straw, brushing your hands over the dust and fur, and reflect on the quiet importance of these creatures. Without them, grain stores would be ravaged, disease more rampant, and daily life more precarious. Yet their presence also adds humor, drama, and lessons in patience. The medieval world thrummed with the unseen activity of these small, clever beings. As night falls, you walk through the village, noting the last flits of movement. Cats nestle in rooftops. Rats scurry one final time before darkness overtakes them, and you feel the lingering sense of balance between human effort and animal cunning. You think about the delicate negotiations, the silent strategies, and the humor embedded in survival. Medieval villagers lived with animals not merely as tools, but as constant, active participants in the rhythm of daily life. Observing them offers a window into human adaptation, ingenuity, and, frankly, the sheer entertainment value of a barnyard full of tiny warriors and stoic hunters. By the time you return to your modest dwelling, the animals have settled. The barn is quiet, and the village hums softly in the evening air. You pause to reflect on the morning and afternoon, the chaotic dances, strategic maneuvers, and occasional surprises that made life unpredictable yet rich. Cats, rats, and mice were small, often overlooked, but their influence on medieval life was profound. They shaped storage practices, hunting traditions, superstition, and even daily humor. Without them, the medieval village would feel hollow, stripped of much of its vibrancy, mischief, and subtle drama. You lie back, exhausted but amused, thinking of the next day. Another round of skirmishes awaits, another ballet of predator and prey, and another opportunity to learn from creatures whose lives are intertwined with yours in ways most modern humans rarely notice. The sun sets, the shadows stretch long, and the barnyard grows still, a tiny ecosystem settling into night. You smile, appreciating the quiet complexity of small lives influencing human survival, and realize that the hidden world of cats, rats, and mice is just as critical, just as lively, and just as endearingly chaotic as any battle in the fields or plow-driven. Labor of the village. You trudge along the narrow lanes of the village, the sun climbing higher and warming your back, as you approach a familiar, excitable presence. Dogs, not just any dogs, but the working, hunting, herding, and occasionally chaotic companions of medieval life. Their tails wag, ears flick, and tongues loll as they anticipate your arrival. Each movement a combination of intelligence, loyalty, and mischief. You probably won't survive a day managing these furry multitaskers without a mixture of patience, quick reflexes, and a sense of humor, but that's exactly the rhythm of life here. Medieval villagers depended on dogs in ways that modern pet owners rarely imagine, for protection, hunting, herding, and even emotional companionship. So, before you settle in, breathe deeply and follow along, because the roles of these dogs are as varied as the humans who trained them. The first dog you encounter is a tall, lean hunting hound, ears perked and nose quivering in the breeze. Its eyes gleam with an intelligence that borders on uncanny. And you realize that hunting dogs weren't just passive followers, they were active strategists. They knew terrain, could track scent over miles, and sometimes even anticipated a hunter's commands before they were given. Fringe historians occasionally argue that some medieval hunting dogs were trained to work semi-independently, making choices based on instinct and prior experience rather than direct human orders. You watch as the hound darts ahead, signaling the start of what will surely be a chaotic but thrilling morning of animal collaboration. In the village square, a smaller herding dog weaves through a flock of geese, clamping down on instinct rather than command. Its movements are precise, almost hypnotic, and you pause to admire the skill. Medieval villagers prized such dogs not only for their labor, but for the intelligence they demonstrated. You recall a quirky account suggesting that some herding dogs were so adept they could lead animals up impossible inclines or through narrow alleyways, reducing human workload considerably. Historians still debate whether this was common practice or limited to elite households, but the evidence in front of you is undeniable. A dog can be as critical to a farm-mess operation as a plow or a pair of oxen. You pause by a hearth where a group of village dogs lounges, tails flicking lazily. Some are mixed breeds, a hodgepodge of working traits and temperaments, while others are specialized. Mastiffs for protection, terriers for vermin, hounds for hunting. Each dog carries a subtle air of authority and skill, often reflected in how they interact with humans. Fringe sources suggest that nobles would even trade or gift prized hunting dogs as symbols of allegiance, a sort of living, breathing currency. You chuckle, imagining a courtly dog exchange with etiquette and fanfare rivaling any human negotiation. As the day progresses, you accompany a villager to the nearby woods for hunting. The hunting hound leads, ears flicking and nose to the ground, guiding you through underbrush and brambles. The dog moves with a fluidity that belies its size, anticipating the flight of game before the human eye can even spot it. You notice the subtle cues: a twitch of a tail, a lowered stance, a barely audible whine that signals the exact moment to stay still or press forward. This silent communication between human and animal is astounding, a combination of instinct, training, and trust. Historians still argue whether such training methods were formalized or largely intuitive, passed down from one generation of hunter to another. Meanwhile, back at the farm, the herding dogs manage livestock with impressive efficiency. Sheep, goats, and even cows respond to commands delivered entirely through subtle gestures, vocalizations, and body language. You observe the dog circling the flock, eyes sharp, paws light, nudging strays back into formation. The livestock obey not just out of fear or conditioning, but seemingly out of respect for the dog's authority. Fringe anecdotes claim that in some villages, a single herding dog could manage entire flocks without human intervention, though this remains debated among scholars. You shake your head in awe, realizing just how integrated these animals were into daily life. Dogs weren't just practical, they were companions. You notice a mastiff resting beside a child, tongue lolling as if guarding and comforting simultaneously. You pat its head, feeling the coarse warmth of fur and the steady pulse of muscle. Some sources suggest that villagers developed bonds with working dogs that went beyond utility, acknowledging their personalities, moods, and quirks. You notice the dog respond to your touch with subtle shifts in posture, a silent language of trust and recognition. Historians still argue whether these relationships were typical or the product of exceptional empathy. But the idea of shared emotional connection resonates clearly. During the hunt, your hound suddenly freezes, ears upright, body taut. You follow its gaze and see a hare dart across the undergrowth. The dog bolts, and you sprint after it, mud splashing and leaves snapping underfoot. Its movements are poetry in motion, agile, strategic, and instinctive. Fringe accounts describe hunting dogs capable of cornering prey without human input, demonstrating both training and natural cunning. You grin, thinking that modern GPS trackers and trail cameras have nothing on this living, breathing marvel. Historians still debate the prevalence of such autonomous skill. But first-hand observation convinces you that extraordinary intelligence was a hallmark of working dogs. By midday, the hunt slows, and you return to the village with your companions. The dogs are wet, muddy, and exhausted, but carry a quiet pride in their eyes. You reward them with scraps, pats, and gentle words. The mastiff curls beside your feet. The hound flops near a fence, and the herding dog trots off to check on livestock. You note that medieval villagers often maintained strict routines for feeding, grooming, and housing dogs, recognizing their importance not just for survival, but for social and psychological stability. Fringe theories suggest that certain households even celebrated their dogs' birthdays or achievements. A charming notion that feels plausible given the affection evident in daily interactions. Afternoon chores bring new challenges. A stray pig escapes into the garden, chased by chickens and a mischievous goat. The herding dog springs into action, corralling the animal with precision and patience. You marvel at how seamlessly human and canine work intertwine, a dance of anticipation, correction, and reward. Historians still argue whether herding dogs were more valued for their temperament or their raw efficiency. But watching this performance makes the question almost irrelevant. Their worth is undeniable. Later, a pack of children runs past, laughing, and the dogs shift positions, protective yet playful. One hound rolls onto its back, exposing its belly, only to spring up when a goose wanders too close. You notice how dogs navigate multiple roles: hunter, guardian, playmate, and occasional comic relief. Medieval villagers relied on these multifaceted companions to manage the unpredictability of daily life, blending labor, security, and joy. Fringe scholars suggest that some villages had unwritten dog codes with expectations and training, methods passed down orally, influencing both animal behavior and human social structure. As evening descends, you trudge to the livestock pens to oversee the final movements. Herding dogs ensure all sheep are accounted for. Hunting dogs settle near the fire for warmth, and mastiffs patrol silently, eyes scanning the horizon. The village itself seems to relax under this invisible canine supervision. You reflect on how much energy, thought, and subtle coordination went into managing these animals, and how deeply integrated their lives were with humans. Historians still argue whether dogs influenced village hierarchies or merely supported existing structures, but your observations hint at a subtle, pervasive impact. Night brings quiet, and the dogs finally rest. You sit on a fence, exhausted, watching shadows lengthen and mingle with the dim glow of hearth fires. The mastiff snores softly, the hound's chest rises and falls rhythmically, and the herding dog curls at the edge of the yard, ears alert even in sleep. Their presence is comforting, a steady heartbeat woven into the life of the village. Fringe sources suggest villagers believed that dogs could sense supernatural threats or impending disasters, a belief that, while debated, reflects the profound trust humans placed in these animals. As you trudge back to your home, the village silent except for the occasional distant bray or bark, you realize that dogs were far more than tools. They were collaborators, teachers, and companions. From protection to hunting, from herding to emotional support, their roles were complex, varied, and essential. Medieval life pulsed with the energy, intelligence, and humor of these animals, shaping daily routines, social interactions, and survival strategies. You collapse onto your bed, exhausted but amused, thinking of the day's chaos, triumphs, and subtle lessons. Dogs, in all their forms, were partners in medieval existence, their influence threading through every field, forest, and home. Observing them offers insight not just into animal behavior, but into human adaptation, ingenuity, and the quiet joy found in cooperation, mutual reliance, and the occasional slapstick mishap. By the time you drift into sleep, You carry with you the image of tails wagging, ears flicking, and a village humming in rhythm with its loyal, clever, and sometimes exasperating canine companions. You trudge along the cobblestone streets of the village, pausing now and then to observe the fluttering wings overhead. Pigeons coo, geese honk, and the occasional falcon circles above, keen-eyed and aloof. Today, you are entering the domain of birds, creatures that medieval humans valued not just for food, but for communication, symbolism, and sometimes sheer spectacle. You probably want to survive a day trying to manage or interpret all their behaviors without a good dose of patience. Maybe a sturdy hackbutt that is exactly what makes their place in daily life so fascinating. Birds in the medieval village were far more than decoration. They were integral to survival, trade, and even social signaling. You pause to watch a flock of pigeons descend onto a rooftop, wings beating against the bright sky. Their movements are precise, almost choreographed, and you notice how humans trained them for communication. Carrier pigeons, often prized for their reliability, carried messages between distant households, towns, or even battlefields. Historians still argue whether the techniques for training these birds were standardized or localized knowledge passed down in secrecy. But watching them now, it's clear that these small creatures were trusted partners in information exchange. Fringe anecdotes even claim that some pigeons could remember faces, distinguishing between friendly villagers and strangers, though this remains debated. It adds a charming layer of intelligence to their mystique. Nearby, geese waddled with loud indignation, honking and flapping as they patrol the edges of the market. You notice the strategic positioning of these birds. Their sharp senses and loud calls make them excellent guardians against intruders. Some medieval households treated geese as living alarm systems, and a particularly noisy goose could deter thieves or warn of approaching strangers. You laugh at the absurdity of being attacked by a goose, yet the villagers' reliance on them was serious business. Historians still debate whether geese were preferred to dogs for certain types of property protection. Given their sharp eyesight and loud voices, but the point is clear. Geese mattered. As you wander through the village square, a merchant sets out baskets of fresh eggs, and you notice pigeons hovering nearby, opportunistic and patient. You toss a small crumb toward one, watching it swoop gracefully, wings catching sunlight in a delicate shimmer. Birds in medieval times weren't just utilitarian. They were symbols of status and taste. Exotic pigeons, bred for color or speed, often adorned the estates of nobility. Fringe sources suggest that pigeons were sometimes used in competitive races, with bets placed on outcomes a tiny, feathery spectator sport. You can't help but imagine villagers cheering quietly from rooftops as pigeons soared across the morning sky. A strange yet charming form of entertainment. Lunch is approaching, and you pause by a pond where ducks glide effortlessly across the water. Their feathers glint in the sun, and you marvel at how humans manage them for both food and eggs. Ducks provided protein, feathers for insulation, and a subtle beauty to the landscape. Fringe accounts suggest some villagers trained ducks to return after foraging, or even to follow paths marked with simple signals. Historians still argue whether such training was widespread or limited to inventive households. But the evidence of repeated patterns suggests a surprising degree of intelligence and adaptability among these birds. You watch a falcon perched high on a rooftop, eyes scanning the streets with predatory precision. Hunting with birds of prey falconry was a highly prestigious activity in medieval Europe. Nobles prized the skill and status associated with training and flying these birds. You notice the subtle signals exchanged between falconer and raptor. A tilt of the wrist, a whispered call, the slightest movement of a glove, all perfectly timed. Fringe historians argue that falconry may have influenced early ideas of animal training and behavioral observation, a precursor to later scientific study. You marvel at the elegance, precision, and partnership displayed here, a mix of utility, entertainment, and artistry. In the village, messenger pigeons are released for practice. You observe as they vanish into the sky, returning hours later with an almost supernatural accuracy. Their reliability in carrying messages across distances was essential during both peacetime and conflict. You remember reading that some pigeons were decorated with tiny, intricate bands to identify ownership, a medieval ID system. Historians still debate whether pigeons could be trained over vast distances or if local familiarity was the key factor. But watching them now, it's hard to doubt their impressive navigational skills. Nearby, a gaggle of geese aggressively defends their pond, wings flaring and honking at your approach. You give a wide berth, smiling at the theatrical performance. These creatures were more than farmyard annoyances. They contributed to safety, food supply, and even social hierarchies. Fringe tales suggest some geese were strategically placed to guard important paths or property, almost like feathery sentinels. You chuckle, thinking of the absurdity of being lectured by a goose while carrying fresh eggs. And yet, the practice is practical, effective, and historically documented. Afternoon arrives, and the village air hums with life. Pigeons roost on rooftops. Geese patrol the edges of streams and pens, and ducks explore ponds with carefree grace. You take a moment to consider the complexity of managing so many species at once. Medieval villagers needed deep knowledge of animal behavior, seasonal cycles, and ecological interaction. Fringe sources suggest that some villagers even had subtle bird languages, cues to anticipate flight patterns or predatory behavior. You shake your head in amusement, imagining secret societies of pigeon whisperers operating in quiet corners of the village. Historians still argue whether such practices were widespread or anecdotal, but either way, birds influenced everything from communication to cuisine. A sudden gust of wind rattles rooftops, and the pigeons burst into coordinated flight, wings beating in rhythmic waves. You follow their movement, fascinated by the precision and fluidity. Birds, unlike livestock, require observation without direct control. A subtle understanding of instinct and environmental cues. You remember the falcon, the geese, the ducks, and see them as actors in a living drama of survival, utility, and occasional spectacle. Fringe anecdotes even describe pigeon couriers returning with critical news in wartime, changing the course of events without ever drawing a sword. The scale of influence is surprising, subtle, and entirely mesmerizing. As evening descends, the village settles into a quieter rhythm. Pigeons find roosts, geese tuck in along pond edges, and ducks glide lazily, feathers catching the last rays of sunlight. You pause on a bridge, listening to the gentle cooing, honking, and splashing, feeling the intertwined pulse of human and avian life. Birds were not merely food or tools. They were symbols, laborers, companions, and occasionally entertainers. Historians still argue whether the cultural value of birds outweighed their practical importance. But observing them now, it seems both dimensions are inseparable. By nightfall, the last glimmers of light catch the feathers of roosting birds, and the village air is punctuated with the soft rustle of wings settling and the occasional distant honk. You sit quietly, absorbing the subtleties. A pigeon shifts its balance, a goose lowers its head protectively, and a duck tucks its bill under a wing. The rhythms, the small dramas, and the quiet coordination of these animals are integral to the texture of daily life. Fringe accounts even suggest villagers whispered to pigeons before release, hoping for safe journeys, a charming mixture of superstition and practical care. As you trudge home, the memory of flapping wings, vigilant geese, and the darting precision of pigeons lingers. Bird-shaped communication, food supply, social status, and daily humor. They were silent collaborators, entertainers, and guardians, their influence subtle yet profound. You smile at the thought of medieval villagers up before dawn, negotiating with feathered allies and rivals alike, understanding that survival relied not only on human skill, but on the delicate, often unpredictable contributions of these avian partners. Finally, you settle by the hearth, exhausted but content. The gentle coo of a pigeon on a rooftop outside your window drifts through the night air, a reminder of the unseen network of life threading through every village, farm, and garden. Birds, in all their complexity, were indispensable to medieval existence, guiding messages, protecting property, providing food, and inspiring awe. Their presence is a subtle, pervasive hum that underpins daily life, an invisible heartbeat weaving through human experience. As vital and entertaining as any creature with fur or hooves. You trudge along the uneven, dusty lanes of the village, hearing the faint, steady rhythm of wings fluttering and the occasional cluck or squawk. Today, your companions are chickens, ducks, and other domestic fowl that strut through the yards, scratch at the earth, and peck at crumbs as if they own the place, which, in many ways, they do. You probably won't survive the morning without stepping on at least one ambitious chick or enduring a goose's indignant honk. But that's part of the charm. Medieval villagers relied on poultry for eggs, meat, feathers, and even fertilizer, creating a microcosm of farm life that demanded both observation and negotiation. So, before you wander too far into the chaos, take a breath, adjust your boots, and follow along through the feathered frenzy. The first flock you encounter is a group of hens pecking industriously near the barn. Their movements are purposeful, synchronized yet individual, as they scratch the dirt for hidden grubs and seeds. Hens were critical to medieval diets. Eggs provided protein year-round, and surplus eggs could be sold or traded in the market. Historians still argue whether hens were primarily valued for productivity or for ritualistic symbolism in religious and festive contexts, but the practical role is undeniable. Fringe accounts even describe certain hens being favored for predictive behavior, such as laying patterns allegedly indicating weather changes, though you remain skeptical. You bend down to inspect a clump of soil the hens have upturned, noting the worms and small insects revealed beneath. Chickens, often dismissed as simple creatures, actually demonstrated remarkable intelligence, recognizing humans and responding to subtle gestures. You toss a few grains toward the hens and watch as they calculate, prioritize, and sometimes compete for each morsel. Fringe historians claim that some medieval villagers developed almost intuitive methods of reading their poultry, noting which hens laid more consistently, which were aggressive, and which were ideal for breeding. You chuckle at the notion of a medieval chicken whisperer, but the evidence is oddly compelling. Nearby, a goose struts imperiously, feathers glinting in the morning sun. Geese were not just food sources, they served as alarm systems, capable of alerting entire households to intruders or danger. A sharp honk could send villagers scrambling to gates, an effective early warning system before the advent of more sophisticated defenses. You watch as the goose hisses at a wandering pig, asserting dominance over both property and poultry alike. Historians still debate whether geese were formally trained or simply allowed to develop defensive behaviors naturally. But either way, the results were effective. Fringe tales even suggest geese were selectively bred for aggression and vigilance, a charming and slightly terrifying notion. As you trudge past the coops, ducks paddle in shallow puddles, flicking their bills and sending ripples across the water. Ducks provided eggs, meat, and feathers for bedding and insulation. Some medieval manuals recommended letting ducks forage freely during the day, returning them to pens in the evening to minimize theft or predation. You notice one particularly clever duck has figured out how to reach an area of the yard that provides the best insects, and you pause to admire its ingenuity. Fringe historians suggest that ducks were sometimes trained to recognize signals, responding to subtle calls or gestures to move from one area to another. A proto-husbandry technique that feels surprisingly modern. A sudden clatter draws your attention. A rooster has taken offense to your presence, strutting aggressively and flaring its tail feathers. Roosters served both practical and symbolic roles. They announced the time, acted as guardians for hens, and sometimes even featured in local folklore or festival games. You dodge a sharp spur and mutter a quiet apology, realizing that while they're small, their authority is absolute. Historians still argue whether roosters were bred more for their protective instincts, their crowing abilities, or simply as status symbols. But you witness firsthand that a confident rooster can dominate a yard with sheer personality. Mid-morning brings feeding duties. You scatter grain in strategic patterns, observing how hens, ducks, and geese interact. Chickens immediately peck and scratch, while ducks often wait for openings, and geese assert dominance with wings extended. There's a social hierarchy here, one that determines access to food, water, and preferred resting spots. Fringe accounts suggest that medieval villagers monitored these hierarchies, selectively breeding dominant or docile birds to maintain balance in the flocks. You can see the wisdom in this. Understanding social dynamics among poultry is surprisingly critical for efficient farming. By noon, the sun warms the yard, and you take a moment to observe the patterns of movement. Hens scratch in loops, ducks swim in spirals, and geese patrol along the edges with military precision. You notice a subtle rhythm, almost musical, in their interactions. You remember the carrier pigeons and the dogs from earlier days, and realize that each animal group operates under its own rules, yet all influence human routines. Historians still argue whether villagers consciously understood these rhythms or simply adapted intuitively. But either explanation highlights a sophisticated understanding of animal behavior. You pause to check a nesting area, where a few hens cluck softly over their eggs. The act of brooding required both patience and protection, and you marvel at the instinctual care displayed. Some medieval households even constructed elaborate nesting boxes to encourage egg-laying, demonstrating that observation and innovation often went hand in hand. Fringe sources suggest that villagers sometimes whispered to hens, believing that a calm voice improved productivity, a practice straddling superstition and practical animal management. You shake your head in amusement, imagining a chicken meditation class. Afternoon work involves rounding up the poultry for feeding, penning, and occasional medicinal treatments. You notice one particularly clever hen sneaking along the fence, evading capture with astonishing skill. You give chase, slipping in mud, and finally corner it, feeling both exasperation and admiration. Hens and ducks, while small, could be surprisingly clever, requiring agility, patience, and quick thinking to manage effectively. Fringe accounts suggest some medieval farmers developed clever traps or routines to manage escape artists, a precursor to modern husbandry practices. By late afternoon, the flocks settle into their usual patterns. Chickens scratch and peck, ducks paddle and preen, geese guard and honk. Roosters patrol with pride, maintaining order and asserting dominance. You pause, brushing straw from your clothes and reflecting on the complexity of daily life mediated by poultry. Historians still debate whether poultry management was driven primarily by nutrition, ritual, or social status, but watching these interactions, the lines blur. The birds are simultaneously food sources, protectors, companions, and performers in a subtle theater of village life. As evening descends, the light softens, casting golden hues over feathers and coop walls. You sit quietly on a fence, observing the final flurry of activity. Chickens return to their perches, ducks huddle near the pond, and geese settle along boundaries. The yard hums with quiet life, a symphony of pecks, quacks, and soft clucks. Fringe accounts suggest that some villagers whispered to their birds at night, blessing them or invoking protection for eggs and health, a ritual blending practicality and superstition. Historians still argue whether these practices were widespread or limited to specific households. But the intent is clear. Medieval humans recognized the profound influence of these creatures on survival and comfort. You trudge back toward the main road, exhausted but amused. The day's labor with fowl has given you insight into coordination, observation, and subtle humor. Hens, ducks, geese, and roosters were indispensable to medieval life, shaping diets, security, and social patterns. Observing them teaches patience, attention to detail, and an appreciation for instinctual behavior. By the time you reach your dwelling, the yard has quieted, the birds have settled, and the village hums softly in preparation for night. Finally, you collapse on a bench, reflecting on the day. Poultry may seem mundane, but their roles were layered, complex, and critical. They influenced food supply, safety, leisure, and ritual practice. The patterns you observe: pecking, social hierarchy, brooding, guarding reveal a sophistication often overlooked in modern imagination. The medieval village depended on the rhythm of these birds as much as the labor of humans, oxen, or dogs. Their presence threads through daily life, silent yet profound, shaping routines, survival strategies, and even local culture. You smile, thinking of the next day when the flurry of feathers, honks, clucks, and quacks will begin anew, a living testament to the hidden role of animals in medieval life. You trudge along the village edge, past the fields and the shallow stream, and feel the soft brush of fur against your hand as a cat winds between your legs. But today, your companions are a different kind of worker. Bees, wasps, and the sometimes overlooked pollinators that made medieval agriculture possible. You probably won't survive a full season without respecting these tiny winged laborers, yet most villagers took their presence for granted until a hive went rogue, a swarm moved too close to a yard, or crops failed without their diligent visits. So, before you adjust your cloak against the midday sun, take a moment to appreciate the microcosm of wings, hum, and hexagons that underpin survival. The first encounter is with a hive suspended in a hollowed tree. Honeybees flit tirelessly from flower to hive, bodies dusted with pollen, wings humming in near-constant motion. Bees were essential to medieval food production, not just for honey, but for pollination, wax, and even medicinal purposes. Historians still argue whether medieval beekeeping techniques were widely shared or closely guarded knowledge passed among farmers in whispers and trades. You approach carefully, inhaling the warm, sweet aroma of wax and nectar, and marvel at the intricate architecture of honeycomb. A structure so precise it seems engineered by tiny, invisible architects. Nearby, you notice the subtle rhythm of bee traffic. Workers leave in waves, returning with shimmering cargo, communicating through delicate dances and pheromones. Fringe historians suggest medieval people recognized these dances as purposeful, noting the direction and distance to forage sites, a kind of natural GPS without instruments. You watch in awe, imagining the skill and attention required to interpret such signals, and wonder how often these observations shaped planting patterns or flower selection. Wasps, less celebrated but equally important, flit along the hedge. You remember their dual reputation: pests in late summer, yet predators of crop-damaging insects. Fringe accounts describe villagers occasionally tolerating certain wasp nests strategically, knowing they kept harmful bugs in check. Historians still debate whether medieval farmers intentionally encouraged beneficial insects or simply coexisted with them by necessity. Either way, the lesson is clear. Survival depended on understanding subtle ecological balances. You trudge further into a sunlit meadow, dotted with clover, daisies, and other flowering plants. Bees land on blossoms, vibrating wings to extract nectar, their legs dusted with pollen that they'll carry back to the hive. The symbiotic relationship is evident. Flowers get pollinated, crops get fertilized, and bees sustain their colony. Fringe accounts even suggest medieval villagers believed that honeybees carried mystical properties, influencing health, fertility, or even local luck. You chuckle at the superstition, but acknowledge that honey did indeed have preservative and medicinal value, a natural remedy in the pre-pharmacy world. Beekeeping was an art and a science. You observe a villager tending a straw skep, carefully inspecting the hive for signs of health or disease. Medieval honey was a sweetener, preservative, and currency of sorts worth more than sugar in some regions. Historians still argue whether beekeeping was primarily economic or ritualistic. given its presence in religious symbolism and feast traditions. You lean closer, noting how the villager uses smoke to calm the bees, a technique surprisingly effective and consistent with modern apicultural practice. Fringe historians suggest that some medieval texts hinted at observing bee behavior to predict weather or social events, blending pragmatism and superstition. A sudden disturbance sends a few bees into defensive flight. You step back, heart racing, as the tiny sentinels circle in warning. Their aggression is precise, not random, and you marvel at their protective instinct. In the medieval mindset, bees were respected, even feared, for their collective power, intelligence, and productivity. Fringe sources describe tales of bee guardians and hives placed strategically near homes to ward off evil spirits, a curious mixture of folklore and practicality. Historians still debate how seriously such beliefs were taken versus being entertaining anecdotes. By midday, the sun warms the meadow and you observe the larger pattern of pollination across multiple flower beds. Bees travel systematically, covering each patch with almost mechanical precision. The colony's efficiency underscores why medieval farmers prized honeybee health. A single strong hive could ensure successful harvests and sustain households through lean months. Fringe accounts suggest that honeybee swarms were sometimes loaned between households, a form of social currency or cooperative labor exchange, though historians still debate how common such practices were. You pause near a clover patch, noting the interplay between bees, flowers, and surrounding insects. Bumblebees arrive with their slower, more deliberate hum, while solitary bees navigate different blooms entirely. Medieval villagers, relying on careful observation, likely understood these differences intuitively, optimizing garden layouts and crop placements. Fringe sources describe simple methods to encourage hive productivity, such as planting aromatic herbs or flowers that thrived in particular soils. You marvel at the integration of ecological knowledge and everyday labor, a practical science rooted in observation and necessity. Afternoon work involves checking a series of hives along the edge of an orchard. Bees enter and exit with unerring accuracy, and you notice a few drones lounging in the sun, serving their reproductive role while workers toil endlessly. Medieval beekeepers sometimes harvested honeycombs seasonally, careful not to destroy the colony. Fringe historians suggest certain hives were rotated among orchards to maximize pollination efficiency, surprisingly sophisticated understanding of crop and insect management. Historians still argue whether these practices were common or experimental. But the logic is undeniable. Healthy hives equaled better harvests, which meant survival and trade. Nearby, a wasp nest clings to the eaves of a barn. Its inhabitants patrol diligently, hunting caterpillars and other pests that might damage stored crops. Few observe quietly, respecting their territory. Fringe anecdotes hint at villagers using wasps as natural insect control in certain households, a method blending ecology with household management. Historians still debate whether this was widespread or limited to inventive farmers. But it highlights the degree to which medieval humans relied on interspecies cooperation, sometimes indirect, for survival. By late afternoon, the meadow hums with activity. Bees have returned to hives, pollinating tasks complete. Wasps patrol their hunting grounds, and solitary insects continue their silent work. You trudge back to the village, dusting pollen from your cloak, reflecting on the subtle but critical influence of these small creatures. Without them, crops would fail, honey would be scarce, and medieval survival would be far more precarious. Fringe accounts describe superstitions regarding hive spirits, protective charms, and weather predictions, blending observation with imagination in a uniquely human attempt to control or understand the natural world. As evening approaches, the sun casts a golden glow over the orchard and meadow. Bees retreat to hives, wasps settle into cracks, and flowers close their petals for the night. You pause, taking in the quiet hum that remains, a testament to unseen labor and delicate ecological balance. Medieval villagers relied on these winged workers not just for sustenance, but for survival, economy, and occasionally spiritual reassurance. Historians still argue about the extent of systematic beekeeping, yet the presence of hives, skep techniques, and honey trade indicates a sophisticated, if localized, knowledge base. Finally, you trudge home, heart and lungs tired but mind buzzing with admiration. The day's work with pollinators reveals the hidden layers of medieval life, the integration of humans and insects into a delicate, productive dance. Bees, wasps, and other pollinators are both utilitarian and symbolic, laborers and teachers, subtle yet essential to survival. By the time you settle by the hearth, the hum of the day lingers, a quiet, pervasive reminder that not all labor is visible, yet all labor is indispensable. You sink into your chair, exhausted yet enchanted, thinking of the next morning when wings will buzz anew, flowers will beckon, and the cycle of pollination and observation will repeat. Medieval life was not just about visible toil. It was sustained by the minute, unseen contributions of creatures whose diligence shaped harvests, diets, and economies. You smile, realizing that the hidden world of winged laborers, buzzing with purpose and ingenuity, is as vital, intricate, and entertaining as any field, barn, or stable you've encountered. You trudge along the riverbank, the cool breeze carrying a mix of damp earth and fresh water, your boots squelching in mud as the sun dips lower in the sky. Today, your focus shifts to the animals that served both the labor and leisure of medieval life: fish, pigs, and the semi-wild beasts that grazed along village edges and riverbeds. You probably won't survive an entire day without stepping into a puddle, dodging a charging pig, or nearly losing your balance chasing a fish out of reach, but that's exactly the rhythm of rural medieval existence. These creatures were essential for nutrition, trade, and sometimes mischief, threading through daily life in ways both practical and unpredictable. The first encounter is with a small pond fed by the river, where fish leap occasionally, scales catching the fading light. Villagers relied on fish not only for food, but as a key protein source during fasting periods prescribed by the church. You notice a boy with a rudimentary net, attempting to catch perch and roach, his focus intense. Historians still argue whether medieval fish farming, known as pond culture, was widespread or limited to monasteries and wealthy estates. But the evidence of carefully managed ponds and artificial stocking suggests a blend of practicality and ingenuity. Fringe accounts even suggest that certain fish were believed to carry medicinal properties, or that observing their behavior could predict weather, a charming intersection of observation, superstition, and survival. Nearby, pigs root energetically in a fenced pen, noses deep in soil, overturning leaves and debris. Pigs were prized for their rapid growth, meat, and fat, which was critical for cooking, preservation, and even candle making. You notice one particularly bold pig has managed to push a section of fence aside, investigating an unguarded compost heap. Fringe sources suggest that medieval pigs were sometimes trained to return to pens at night or to follow designated pathways to prevent destruction of crops, a practice historians still debate regarding its prevalence and effectiveness. You duck as the pig snuffles aggressively near your ankle, muttering a quiet apology and admiring the animal's strength and intelligence. Fishing itself is both art and necessity. You kneel beside the pond, watching ripples form and imagining the patience required to maintain a diet rich in freshwater sources. Villagers use nets, hooks, and simple traps, often relying on knowledge passed down through observation rather than written instructions. Fringe anecdotes describe elaborate fish weirs constructed along rivers to channel schools into catchable areas, a technique that blends human ingenuity with ecological understanding. Historians still argue whether these techniques were common across villages or limited to resource-rich estates, but watching the boy work, you recognize a tradition honed by experience. You trudge along the riverbank, noticing a few ducks gliding serenely while small eels slither beneath the surface. Ducks often serve dual roles as food sources and as natural pest controllers in ponds and rice fields, nibbling on insects that threatened crops. Fringe accounts even describe villagers releasing ducks strategically to manage mosquito populations or fertilize soil with droppings. Historians still debate how intentional these practices were versus accidental benefits, but you note the subtle interplay between human planning and ecological opportunity. The pigs, meanwhile, have become more audacious. One ventures past the fence and begins investigating a field where a few turnips grow. You chase it gently, realizing that pigs' intelligence and curiosity made them both valuable and challenging. Fringe historians claim some households use bell collars or simple verbal cues to manage roaming pigs, an early form of domestication management. You pause, watching the pig root up a particularly large vegetable, and can't help but admire its cunning and determination. Historians still argue whether pigs were primarily free-range or tightly controlled, but either strategy required observation, patience, and creativity. By afternoon, you reach a river bend where villagers fish with rudimentary traps. Fish dart in and out of shadow, their scales reflecting dappled sunlight. You kneel beside a woven trap and watch a carp nudge its way inside. Medieval diets heavily relied on freshwater fish, particularly in regions where meat was restricted during religious fasts. Fringe sources suggest that certain fish species were preferred not just for taste, but for their symbolic value, appearing in religious iconography or local myths. Historians still debate whether symbolic preferences influence practical farming decisions, but the overlap between ritual, diet, and ecology is unmistakable. Nearby, a small boorish pig trots along the bank, eyeing scraps and occasionally rooting for small clams or plant matter near the river's edge. You pause to consider how semi-wild pigs were integrated into the village economy, allowed to forage, yet managed with fences and careful feeding. Fringe accounts describe pigs as a kind of living compost machine, breaking down vegetation while enriching soil with droppings, a practice that modern permaculture enthusiasts would likely admire. Historians still argue whether these practices were standardized or simply adopted ad hoc by inventive villagers. But the functional outcome is clear. You trudge further upstream and notice a family collecting crayfish using simple baskets and their hands. Crayfish, eels, and smaller freshwater fish supplemented diets and provided protein when larger catches were scarce. Fringe sources suggest villagers sometimes used miniature traps baited with grain or fish scraps, an early form of aquatic ingenuity. Historians still debate whether such methods were localized knowledge or common practice. But the careful observation and improvisation required is evident in every movement. By late afternoon, you trudge back to the village, pond and river left behind, pigs settled in pens, fish swimming in controlled waters, and ducks returning to roost. You pause to reflect on the delicate balance required: knowledge of animal behavior, patience in observation, and subtle management strategies all combined to sustain the village. Fringe accounts even describe ritualized blessings of rivers and ponds, combining superstition with practical concern to ensure both ecological and spiritual favor. Historians still argue about the prevalence and sincerity of such practices, but the outcomes: efficient food and thriving livestock's undeniable. As evening falls, you trudge past the pen one last time. The pigs huddle together, snouts in straw, resting from the day's exploits. Ducks float calmly in shallow water, while small fish dart near the surface, finishing their daily forage. The river hums softly in the fading light, a constant reminder of life's rhythm. Medieval villagers relied on these creatures not just for sustenance, but for structure, routine, and sometimes entertainment, watching their behaviors and adapting accordingly. Fringe accounts suggest that observing the interaction between pigs and river life could even hint at weather changes or impending food scarcity, a practical blend of instinct and intuition. Finally, you return to your dwelling, mud on boots, hands slightly sticky with fish, slime, and hay, exhausted yet impressed. The day's work with pigs, fish, and semi-wild animals has revealed the hidden complexity of medieval survival. Labor was rarely human alone, and success depended on cooperation, observation, and respect for the intelligence of other species. You settle by the hearth, reflecting on the subtle choreography of daily life. A pig rooting, a fish darting, a duck paddling network of interdependent actors, all contributing to the delicate balance that sustained the village. As you sink into your chair, listening to the evening river hum and the distant snorts of pigs settling for the night, you understand that medieval life was not merely laborious. It was a series of interactions, negotiations, and subtle partnerships with the animals around you. Their influence is everywhere, shaping diet, security, and labor, yet often invisible to the casual observer. You smile, thinking of the next day when these creatures will rise again. And the dance of survival, observation, and occasional chaos will resume, quietly sustaining life as it has for centuries. You trudge through the village at dawn, the mist curling along the cobblestones, and hear the low, mournful bray of donkeys, the clop of hooves on packed earth, and the distant neigh of horses. Today, your companions are the beasts of burden horses, oxen, and donkeys, the unsung engines of medieval life. You probably won't survive a day in the fields without bruised shoulders, aching back, or muddy boots. But that's precisely why these animals were so indispensable. They carried loads, plowed fields, transported water, and even ferried people across rugged terrain, silently shaping the rhythm of every village day. The first animal you encounter is a sturdy ox yoked to a plow, its broad shoulders heaving as it tugs through the furrowed earth. You watch the villager guiding the plow, reins in hand, sweat glistening on his forehead. Oxen were prized for their strength and endurance rather than speed, making them ideal for heavy labor on the farm. Historians still argue whether oxen were universally preferred to horses for plowing or if regional factors, soil type, climate, or economic considerations dictated choice. But the practical efficiency is clear. Fringe accounts even describe oxen being talked to in gentle monotones, a practice believed to calm them and improve cooperation, a charming mix of superstition and observation. Nearby, a donkey trots along a narrow lane, carrying sacks of grain on its back. Donkeys, smaller but agile, were often used for transport in tighter spaces where oxen or horses would struggle. You marvel at their sure-footedness and ability to carry heavy loads without complaint. Fringe historians suggest that donkeys were sometimes trained to understand simple signals for pacing and stopping, making them surprisingly cooperative partners. You pause to pat the donkey, appreciating the quiet intelligence reflected in its eyes. Consider how vital these animals were for everyday survival. Horses graze nearby, their sleek coats glinting in the morning sun. Some are riding mounts for messengers or elite villagers, while others pull carts or plows. Horses allowed for faster travel, trade, and military mobility, shaping both local economies and regional networks. Fringe sources suggest that certain horses were selectively bred for temperament as well as speed, creating early lines of specialized working and riding breeds. Historians still debate how widespread such selective breeding was outside noble estates, but the impact of horses on trade and communication is undeniable. You trudge alongside the plow team, observing the rhythm of labor. Oxen move in measured steps, the wooden plow biting into the soil, furrows forming a repeating pattern of human and animal effort. Villagers relied on these beasts not only for work, but for predictable routines. Planting, harvesting, and transporting goods all depended on their energy and cooperation. Fringe accounts describe plow songs or rhythmic calls designed to synchronize movement, an oral technique blending practicality with morale. Historians still argue whether these practices were formalized or simply intuitive, passed down through generations of farmers. By midday, the sun warms the village, and you notice a small team of horses pulling a cart laden with firewood. The horses' muscles ripple with effort, nostrils flaring, ears twitching in alertness. You watch the villagers shift the reins, communicating subtle adjustments that direct the team without verbal commands. Fringe anecdotes suggest that horses were capable of understanding weight distribution and anticipating changes in terrain. Almost instinctively, a skill that often exceeded human expectations. Historians still debate the extent of such training, but the practical, outcomes-efficient transportation and minimized accidents speak for themselves. You pause by a water trough where oxen and donkeys drink deeply, tails swishing to deter flies. Their cooperation with humans extended beyond labor. Managing their health, diet, and comfort was essential. Fringe sources suggest that medieval villagers sometimes consulted rudimentary guides on care, recognizing symptoms of illness or fatigue in subtle behavioral cues. Historians still argue whether these guides were common knowledge or limited to specialized workers, but observation and experience were clearly paramount. A sudden neigh alerts you to a young foal testing its legs, prancing awkwardly but spiritedly near its mother. Foals, while not yet useful for labor, represented the future workforce of the village. Raising animals for long-term utility required careful planning, timing births to seasons, managing feed, and training them gradually for work. Fringe historians speculate that villagers sometimes used playful methods, like encouraging foals to follow carts or mimic adult movements, a kind of early animal education. You smile at the foal's clumsy energy, realizing that every generation of beasts of burden required patience, strategy, and sometimes a sense of humor. Afternoon arrives, and you trudge through fields where oxen are yoked in teams, pulling plows through soil, turning seeds and compost into fertile furrows. The synchronization between human and animal is remarkable. Subtle shifts in the plowman's stance, light tugs on the yoke, and vocal cues guide the oxen with near-perfect precision. Fringe sources claim that some farmers believed oxen could sense weather changes, stopping or slowing when storms approached, though historians still debate whether this was superstition or keen observation of instinctual behavior. Either way, the outcomes affected planting, harvesting, and survival. Nearby, a cart pulled by a pair of donkeys navigates a narrow lane, laden with vegetables destined for market. The animals pause at a tricky incline, adjusting their gait and stance almost instinctively. Medieval villagers relied on these small but resilient animals for everyday transportation, bridging the gap between fields, homes, and markets. Fringe accounts even describe mini donkey relay systems, where animals and carts rotated between households for efficiency, charming precursor to organized delivery networks. Historians still debate the prevalence of such systems, but the ingenuity behind them is evident. By late afternoon, the sun lowers, and you observe the village's beasts of burden settling. Oxen relax near barns, nostrils flaring as they exhale the day's effort. Horses are hosed and groomed, tails swishing. Donkeys are fed and checked for abrasions from harnesses. The care of these animals was an integral part of human labor, and neglect could mean disaster for the household's productivity. Fringe sources suggest that villagers sometimes marked animals with simple symbols or bells, bows for identification and to ensure accountability in shared or communal resources. Historians still argue about how systematic these practices were, but their presence illustrates thoughtful management. You trudge home alongside the river, reflecting on the intertwined rhythm of humans and their working animals. Oxen, horses, and donkeys were not just tools. They were partners, teachers, and occasionally mischief makers. Their intelligence and physical power shaping the economic, agricultural, and social life of the village. Fringe accounts describe subtle bonds between humans and these animals, built through observation, routine, and shared labor, which might resemble early forms of empathy and mutual respect. Historians still debate how deeply villagers emotionally connected with their animals, but the reliance and interaction are clear. As evening descends, you watch the animals settle for the night. Oxen huddle in shaded pens, horses nibble on hay with relaxed posture, and donkeys stretch in the warm, fading light. Their daily work complete, the village can rest, confident in tomorrow's productivity. You realize that medieval life pulsed through these creatures as much as through human labor. Every seed sown, every cart hauled, every field plowed depended on the quiet strength, patience, and cooperation of these unsung heroes. Finally, you sit by the hearth, boots muddy, hands scented faintly of hay and sweat, exhausted but reflective. Beasts of burden may not have wings or claws, but their presence was no less vital. Their strength, intelligence, and cooperation shaped survival, trade, and social structure. You smile, thinking of the next day when the rhythm of yokes, hooves, and harnesses will resume, silently sustaining life, work, and the hidden heartbeat of the medieval village. You trudge into the waning light of the village, the air thick with the mingled scents of hay, mud, and the faint tang of smoke from cooking fires. Today, your companions are the animals that served in subtler, often overlooked roles: cats, dogs, and other domestic companions who navigated between the thresholds of work, protection, and companionship. You probably won't survive a full day without being scratched, nipped, or startled by a particularly curious feline or territorial dog, but that's part of the charm. These creatures were woven into medieval life as guardians, pest controllers, and even emotional anchors, their influence extending into nearly every household. The first you notice is a tabby cat slinking along a wall, ears twitching, tail flicking with cautious elegance. Cats were essential in medieval villages, controlling rodents that threatened grain stores, kitchens, and seed supplies. You watch as it crouches, muscles coiled, and pounces with precision, capturing a mouse in a single swift movement. Historians still argue whether cats were domesticated primarily for pest control or whether their symbolic and mystical associations contributed equally to their presence in homes. Fringe accounts suggest that some cats were believed to carry protective charms against witches or disease, though you can't help but admire their practical role in keeping infestations at bay. Nearby, a small hound follows a villager, paws splashing in puddles, eyes alert to movement in the brush. Dogs served multiple purposes: hunting, guarding property, herding livestock, and providing companionship. You notice how the dog anticipates commands, adjusting its pace, head tilts, and ear flicks in response to subtle cues. Fringe historians suggest that medieval hunters sometimes selected dogs for temperament and agility, creating early breeds optimized for specific tasks. Historians still debate how formalized breeding was outside noble estates, but the observable intelligence and cooperation in these animals is undeniable. You pause at a granary and notice a cat perched above, eyes gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Its presence is dual purpose: a sentinel against rodents and a subtle companion in otherwise monotonous daily labor. Fringe accounts describe cats being fed specific treats or even allowed access to certain rooms as a reward for pest management, suggesting early understanding of positive reinforcement. Historians still argue whether this was widespread or anecdotal. But either way, the coexistence between humans and cats reflects a careful negotiation of behavior and utility. A dog barks sharply at a stranger approaching the village edge, tail stiff and hackles raised. Medieval villagers relied on such instinctual alert systems for protection, especially in smaller settlements where human vigilance alone might not suffice. You note the subtle interplay of trust and control. The dog is expected to assess threats, while the human interprets signals and intervenes only if necessary. Fringe sources suggest that some dogs were even assigned to specific households or livestock pens, a system ensuring accountability and effective protection. Historians still debate whether such assignment was widespread or experimental, but the practical outcome, security and peace of mind, is obvious. Cats, meanwhile, patrol roof beams and nooks, inspecting shadows and corners for movement. Their stealth contrasts with the dog's overt vigilance, creating a complementary system of surveillance and pest management. Fringe accounts suggest that some medieval households believed cats could detect supernatural disturbances or disease, blending practical pest control with superstition. Historians still argue about the prevalence of such beliefs. But cats' presence undeniably reduced rodent populations, improved food security, and perhaps even saved entire harvests. You trudge further into the village, noticing a small pack of farm dogs herding geese along a pond. Their coordination is impressive. One dog blocks an exit, another nudges stragglers, and a third maintains peripheral observation. Medieval herding practices relied on such teamwork, often guided by minimal vocal cues or hand signals. Fringe sources describe early methods of training herding dogs through mimicry and repetition, practices strikingly similar to modern techniques. Historians still debate whether these methods were systematic or learned through trial and error. But the efficiency is evident in every movement. As midday transitions to afternoon, cats lounge lazily near the hearth, occasionally swatting at passing insects, while dogs accompany villagers to fields, acting as sentries and companions. Their presence mediates not just labor, but emotional well-being. Long hours of repetitive work are softened by their attentive gaze, playful antics, or the comfort of warmth at night. Fringe historians even claim that some villagers recognize the therapeutic value of these animals, incorporating them into routines for mental relief and social bonding. Historians still debate the intentionality behind this recognition, but you can see it clearly in the mutual dependence observed. A sudden scuffle draws your attention. A cat hisses at a particularly bold mouse, while a dog observes cautiously, ready to intervene if needed. This small theater illustrates a larger truth. Domestic animals contributed to the village ecosystem in layered, complementary ways. Cats, dogs, and even smaller companions like ferrets or tame birds created an invisible web of labor and oversight that humans relied upon daily. Fringe accounts suggest that these animals sometimes guided agricultural decisions indirectly by influencing storage practices or pest control strategies. Historians still argue about the extent of this influence, but its presence is undeniable. By late afternoon, the village is alive with subtle activity. Cats stretch and groom themselves, dogs patrol paths and accompany children, and even the occasional barn owl or domestic bird adds to the chorus of alertness. You pause to observe a dog resting under a cart, eyes tracking movement, ready to spring into action. The relationship between humans and these companions is multidimensional, practical, emotional, and occasionally symbolic. Fringe sources suggest that villagers sometimes imbued animals with names, personalities, and social status within the household, highlighting a blend of pragmatism and affection. Historians still debate whether these practices were widespread or confined to certain households. But the interaction speaks to the nuanced role animals played. As evening descends, you trudge past the pens, hearths, and fences. Cats settle on windowsills, dogs curl near the fire, and the village hums quietly with life. Their labor is subtle but essential. Cats control vermin. Dogs provide protection and assistance, and both offer companionship that softens the rigor of daily toil. Fringe accounts describe villagers whispering to cats or stroking dogs to ensure good behavior, blending superstition with practical training. Historians still debate how much these rituals affected productivity, but the mutual understanding and coexistence are clear. Finally, you settle by the hearth, the fire crackling, shadows stretching across walls, and the village slowly quieting. Cats curl in corners, dogs lie in waiting, and the invisible network of vigilance and companionship continues. You reflect on the hidden role these animals played. Their intelligence, responsiveness, and subtle labor sustained households, safeguarded food, and occasionally provided solace after long, grueling days. Medieval life pulsed not only through human effort, but through the silent, often overlooked contributions of these domestic companions. You sigh, exhausted yet reflective, understanding that the day's work, the villagers' routines, and even leisure depended on these relationships. Cats, dogs, and small companions were not just adjuncts to human survival. They were partners, co-workers, and friends, integral to the rhythm of life. You imagine the night settling fully, the village asleep, with these animals quietly patrolling, hunting, resting, or dreaming alongside humans. Their influence is subtle, pervasive, and enduring. A reminder that survival, comfort, and daily rhythm are always shared endeavors.